And I think increasingly, we need to reimagine the institutions that we have created in the past from this new humanitarian, human-centered, inclusive lens. And this is something that's going to take a long time.
That's the voice of Dr. Aditi Verma, Stanton Nuclear Security Postdoctoral Fellow at the Belfer Center. She, along with research scholars Dr. Denia Djokic and Dr. Katlyn Turner, are today's guests on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here are your co-hosts, Michelle Dover and Tom Collina.
Welcome back to Press the Button and Happy New Year.
A Happy New Year to you too, Michelle. We hope everyone had a relaxing and safe holiday season, and we are eager to hit the ground running in 2021.
I'm going to tempt fate and say I'm excited to see what 2021 has in store. But first, let's get into today's episode. Tom, what do you have lined up for us on Early Warning?
We'll be talking about National Security Advisor designate Jake Sullivan's welcome remarks over the weekend about extending the New START treaty and rejoining the Iran nuclear deal, and how that just got more complicated now that Iran has begun enriching uranium up to 20%. We'll tell you what that means and why it matters.
After that, I sit down with a trio of scholars who, along with several other experts, made a bold call for anti-racist action and accountability in today's nuclear field in an article in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists last year. It is the first installment of a two-part series we're doing on the topic, with the second interview coming out in just a few weeks.
And finally, I answer a question about nuclear New Year's resolutions on this week's Q&A segment. And remember, if you want your question answered on the air, tweet or DM us at PressButtonPod, or send us an email at pressthebutton@plowshares.org. We would love to hear from you.
And if you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating wherever you get your podcasts. And it's not too late to make your own nuclear New Year's resolutions. If you could, tell just one person about today's show. Every new listener helps us build our audience and our impact. But with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, Early Warning. Early Warning. Early Warning. Early Warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thank you, Del. Good news and bad news to start the new year. And here to help us understand it all is Mary Kaszynski, Deputy Policy Director here at Plowshares Fund. Mary, Happy New Year, and thanks for being here.
Thanks, Tom. Happy New Year, everybody.
Let's start with the good news. Over the weekend, President-elect Joe Biden's incoming National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, said on CNN that the new administration would move quickly to renew New START, the last remaining major nuclear arms treaty with Russia. The incoming administration would have just 16 days after the inauguration to work with Russia to extend New START because the treaty expires on February 5. This should be possible since Russia also supports a simple extension, and it would not require Senate approval. Of course, in just one of Trump administration's many acts of malpractice, Trump could have extended New START at any time in the last year, but chose to focus instead on a failed effort to bring China into the agreement. Sullivan also reiterated support for the 2015 Iran nuclear deal and said that as soon as Iran re-enters compliance with the deal, which Sullivan helped negotiate in the Obama administration, there would be a follow-on negotiation over its missile capabilities. So the good news is the incoming administration sees nuclear arms control as one of the few areas where Washington and Moscow can cooperate. So now the bad news, making the Iran issue more complicated. Tehran on Monday began enriching uranium up to 20% at an underground facility and seized a South Korean oil tanker in the Strait of Hormuz, further escalating tensions. This comes as no surprise, as Iran informed the International Atomic Energy Agency last week that it planned to take the step on enrichment. And the agency said Monday that it has been monitoring activities at Fordo, the underground facility, and that it planned to issue a report to member states later today. And of course, Iran's announcement coincides with the anniversary of the U.S. drone strike, killing Revolutionary Guard General Soleimani in Baghdad last year. And of course, Iran responded to that by launching ballistic missiles at U.S. bases in Iraq, injuring dozens of U.S. troops. And Tehran also accidentally shot down a Ukrainian passenger jet that night, killing all 176 people on board. So, Mary, I have questions. As we just discussed, Iran is resuming enrichment to 20%. So tell us what this means for Iran's nuclear program and the future of the deal.
Yeah, so the really important thing to keep in mind here, well, there are a couple of things. So first, this is a really problematic step. Enriching to 20% does put Iran dangerously close to enriching to weapons-grade uranium. But Iran is clearly not dashing for a nuclear weapon, right? This is not a major development. This does not indicate that Iran has decided to build nuclear weapons. If they were to decide to do that, it would still take them some time just to get enough nuclear material for a bomb. So no dash for a nuclear weapon, no change there in terms of Iran's intentions.
So you would see this as an effort for Iran to bring attention to this issue and to kind of accelerate the momentum within a new Biden administration.
Exactly. It's pretty clearly a political signal here. They're trying to pressure the Biden administration and they're trying to build up leverage, right? So the more Iran can trade away and the more they have that's easy to trade away, like downblending or shipping out a bunch of uranium, that puts pressure on the Biden administration to move quickly and it gives Iran, more leverage in those negotiations.
And there's nothing irreversible about this, correct?
Exactly. And Iranian officials have already tweeted about this. So they're making a big deal about this step, but they're also caveating it very clearly by saying that these steps are all easily reversible if the U.S. comes back in as well.
So not a showstopper in terms of the U.S. and Iran getting back in the deal, but complicates things.
Exactly. And it's also, it'll be interesting to see what, if anything, Iran does in response to the 1-year anniversary of the assassination of the Iranian general Soleimani. This could be that response. And if it is, that's a very good sign that Iran is serious about rejoining the nuclear deal upon Biden's inauguration.
So if the United States and Tehran succeed in getting back into the deal, Jake Sullivan said that there's a prospect of negotiating with Iran after that, a new agreement on its ballistic missile program. What do you make of that? How important is it and how realistic is it?
Yeah, so I think there are two really important things to note here about the Sullivan interview. One is follow-on negotiations, and that word is very key, follow-on, right? So these negotiations depend on the U.S. and Iran first coming back into compliance with the nuclear deal. Then we can talk about follow-on negotiations on ballistic missiles and other issues. The other important thing to note is that Sullivan very clearly said that ballistic missiles should be on the table. That puts missiles in with a bunch of other issues that the U.S. and Iran want to negotiate on, right? So missiles is certainly one of them. Iran's missile activities are very dangerous. They're destabilizing, violate UN Security Council resolutions. So certainly, negotiating on missiles is something that the U.S. and allies would be very interested in.
And what other issues do you see on the table?
I think a main one, honestly, will be strengthening the JCPOA. So there are some limits of the current deal that expire beginning in 2025. So there's a few years to go. But, that will also be a high priority, is sort of extending some of those nuclear limits, especially given, Iran's recent activities on the nuclear front.
Thanks. And last question, Mary, for you. The Trump administration recently canceled the return of the aircraft carrier Nimitz from the Persian Gulf, saying the carrier will remain deployed due to, quote, recent threats issued by Iranian leaders, unquote. What should we be on the lookout for in the last few weeks of the Trump administration that could get us in trouble and possibly lead to war with Iran?
Yeah, so this announcement is sort of par for the course when it comes to the Trump administration's maximum pressure strategy. The Trump administration has not only piled on an enormous number of sanctions, sanction after sanctions doesn't really do anything on Iran. They've also made some very belligerent statements and sort of empty threats against Iran. This appears to be part of sort of a political strategy to provoke Iran. So trying to push Iran to take some provocative steps that could provide the U.S. a pretext for military action. So that's something to be on the lookout for, is more of these potentially more sanctions, more statements from Secretary of State Pompeo or even President Trump himself about, references to Iranian threats and trying to provoke Iran to do something that, could provide the U.S. for an excuse for some kind of response that, again, would escalate and then make it more difficult for Biden to return to the JCPOA.
Well, let's hope that early 2021 does not bring a military confrontation with Iran. And Mary, thank you so much for your expert commentary. Always a pleasure to talk. And I'm sure we will talk about this issue again.
Last August, a group of scholars published an article in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists titled "A Call for Anti-Racist Action and Accountability in the U.S. Nuclear Community." It was powerful and sparked a lot of conversation in the nuclear field, leading us to invite on Dr. Katlyn Turner and Dr. Lauren Borja, two of the authors, to discuss racism in the nuclear field. But obviously, one conversation was not going to cut it. So today I'm sitting down with three of the authors, Dr. Katlyn Turner, Dr. Denia Djokic, and Dr. Aditi Verma, to take this discussion further. Katlyn is a research scientist in the Space-Enabled Research Group at the MIT Media Lab. Denia is a current associate and former postdoctoral research fellow at the Belfer Center. And Aditi is a Stanton Nuclear Security postdoctoral fellow at the Belfer Center. And I just want to point out, all of these scholars are previously or currently affiliated with the Belfer Center's project on managing the atom, which I just think is a really cool example of how one organization can bring together such talent. And I am so glad that you three could join. And before we get started, I just wanted to call out your other fantastic co-authors, Drs. Medica Monk and Lauren Borja, who aren't on today, but are a huge part of the project. So with that, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having us, Michelle.
First things first, thank you so much for writing this. I know there are quite a few people in the field who feel the same way, but I feel like this article was one of the first pieces that really crystallized what people have been wondering about, thinking about, asking questions about when it comes to racism in the nuclear field. And you lay out in this piece how systemic racism, specifically in our area, is produced and sustained in two different but connected ways. Specifically, you describe these two types of racism, epistemic and institutional, and how they're present in the field today. So I think just to get us started, what are they? And Denia, I know you had some thoughts on this.
So first of all, thank you, Michelle, for having us on today. We're really excited to be discussing our article with you. And just before I dive into the answer to your question, I would just really quickly like to express our deepest gratitude to all of our friends and colleagues that shared their experiences and insights and feedback with us during the writing of this article. Especially to Professors Gabrielle Hecht at Stanford and Susan Silby at MIT for revising and editing this piece. Everyone's contribution was crucial to the shaping of this article and its arguments. Also, we would not have been able to write this article without the vast amounts of existing scholarship on the intersection of racial injustices, the vestiges of colonialism and nuclear technologies. So thank you to all the amazing scholars out there whose work we were able to draw on and pull together. And for those of you who will go and read the article, I recommend following the hyperlinks in which we link to the scholarship for deeper reading. Our article describes two main ways that racism manifests in the nuclear field. As you said, epistemically and institutionally. By epistemic racism, we mean, generally speaking, the practice of excluding certain types of knowledges from our professional spaces. More specifically, just to kind of illustrate that, we mean, one, the erasure of histories of colonial dehumanization and the exploitation of people of color. Two, the dismissal of research on and by people and communities of color as not legitimate areas of study. And lastly, the negation of the embeddedness of racist values in nuclear technologies and their governance, and their thus disproportionate impacts along racial lines. By institutional racism, we mean the complex mesh of mechanisms, policies, and attitudes that create and sustain the barriers that preclude people of color from full participation in the institutions that comprise the nuclear field. And by those, I mean institutions like universities, think tanks, national labs, the nuclear industry, even in some cases, especially historically, government commissions that inform legislation, etc. Epistemic and institutional racism are not operating independently of each other. They mutually reinforce each other. So simply put, racist attitudes in institutions work either visibly or invisibly to keep out ways of knowing, thinking, telling stories, even designing technologies by people who are not generally considered part of the traditionally dominant class. So this exclusion, in turn, prevents people of color from contributing to and being represented in the nuclear field. And I really want to highlight that it's super, super important to understand and address both ways at the same time that racism manifests itself in our field if we are to affect any meaningful change in our professional spaces. Our hope in writing this article was that it would serve as a starting point for discussion, accountability, and most importantly, action to stop perpetuating and ultimately, perhaps even precluding, even if unintentionally, the rectification of racial injustices in the nuclear field.
And Aditi, I know you had some thoughts on this as well.
Yes, thank you so much, Michelle, again, for having us. I would just add to that there's a tendency in the nuclear field to see technologies as apolitical and ahistoric and sort of removed from their context. But it's actually the case that technologies are infused with the values and the judgments and the norms of the people who design them. And in that way, these technologies carry the norms of the past to the present. And there are massive systems of governance and organizations that are also designed around these technologies. And so I say all of that just to make the point that these technologies and the institutions around them themselves have momentum, and they carry the racist ideas and norms of the past into the present. And so this is really another way in which epistemic and institutional racism sort of reinforce each other over time, and how both become embedded in the systems and the artifacts that the nuclear field designs and creates and puts out into the world. And so as we reflect on how to diagnose and remedy the harms that the nuclear field and community has caused, I think we have to examine it both from an institutional perspective and also an epistemic perspective. And that's why we really see those two things, as we've written about them in the piece, as being really important lenses through which to look at the field and the community.
So I know for me, when I think about problems that are as big and pervasive as racism, often I have to start with one example or concrete thing that I have witnessed or seen that really just causes me to dig further. Do you have those types of examples in your own mind are driving your own work, so that when you think about these frames, these are the images that come to mind?
So I can talk about an example of nuclear waste, which is my expertise that I've done a lot of work on. So when we talk about nuclear waste management, we love to consider the far future, 10,000 to 1,000,000 years into the future, where admittedly humans may or may not even exist. But we completely neglect the present and the near future, the 30 to 100 years or 200-year future, which means that without even realizing it, without even perhaps intending to, we're neglecting the less resourced, predominantly Black and Brown people who are impacted today by the mismanagement or management of nuclear waste. These scenarios are literally caught up over, congressional hearings, debates over whether things are safe, based on models that are literally projected into a time where we have no idea, absolutely no idea, especially considering the impacts of climate change, what the world will look like. We're constantly looking for places to site nuclear waste facilities in areas where people are less resourced, less empowered. They're often within predominantly Black, Brown, particularly Indigenous people live, or adjacent to those communities in the US and in Canada, for example. And when we consider the type of labor force that may be employed at a nuclear waste facility, we're really thinking about, again, less resourced, less empowered, less privileged, less valued workers, akin to miners, for example. And we don't have any conversations about the experiences, questions, concerns, harms, et cetera, that those potential workers will face. And so when we additionally neglect sites that have already been inadvertently turned into nuclear waste dumps, like uranium mining sites, for example, what are we really saying about nuclear waste? And what are we really saying about the people who live near nuclear waste? It's not considered sexy or cutting edge in the context of the nuclear enterprise to even work on nuclear waste. So what are we saying, therefore, with that devaluation about stewardship, about sustainability, and about what we owe systematically to people who exist today and are impacted today by the mismanagement of nuclear material?
Denia, Aditi, did you have any other examples that come to mind for you?
Yes, I wanted to jump on the point of uranium mining that Kate just raised. I wanted to mention that I learned yesterday, I didn't even know, and we've been kind of on this and researching this for a long time, and by this I mean racial injustices in our professional environment, and kind of the impacts of nuclear technology that follow along racial lines. And I just learned yesterday in this panel that about 70% of the globally mined uranium in the world is from mines either on or near Indigenous lands. And that to me is a shockingly high number. And it is something, and I can speak to this as a person who has a degree in nuclear engineering, as an example of epistemic racism. We in our curricula do not sit with these uncomfortable knowledges. We don't engage with this. And like Kate so eloquently said, we don't ask ourselves these questions of what does that mean about how we see certain people and how we see our technology as embedded in society.
So I think a third example that I would add to what Kate and Denia have just said has to do with the ways in which the nuclear field broadly and nuclear engineering specifically thinks about risk. So the ways in which nuclear engineers in particular think about risk are very quantitative. And this way of thinking about risk specifically as a product of the consequence of something bad happening and its probability of happening really arose in the field in the late 1960s and early 1970s, when the field sort of found, and by field I mean nuclear engineering, found this emerging body of work in risk studies. And it sort of attached itself to that particular way of thinking about risk. And concluded as a field and as a community that we could only think about risk in these strictly rational and quantitative ways. And one of the byproducts of that is that as a field and community, we came to think about the ways in which the public thinks about risk, which is sometimes more affective, more qualitative. We came to think about these non-quantitative ways of thinking about risk as not being legitimate. And we've essentially excluded or undervalued the ways in which the publics think about risk in the field for so long. And this is really important because these ways of thinking about risk that we've decided are the correct ways of thinking about it have informed how we design technologies, how we design the institutions to govern those technologies, and how we decide what harms are acceptable and what are not. And what is so striking, which is something that I've found in my own research, I study how the designers of nuclear reactors think about risk in the very early stages of design when they're making some of the most consequential design choices that have an impact on risk and safety. Well, it actually turns out that the ways in which these designers think about risk and safety in those early stages are exactly the same as the public's. And so these stories that we've been telling ourselves about experts being strictly rational and thinking about risk only quantitatively, those stories have all been wrong. And so I think as we work to repair the damage that the field as a whole has done, we really have to re-examine not just our institutions, but also some of our very fundamental intellectual premises.
So picking up on this thread of grappling with what we have and what our reality is, Kate, how does the history affect our present day?
That's a really good question, Michelle. And I think that many people who get stuck sometimes thinking about racism and anti-racism, what I like to point them to is this history. It's really important to understand that in the past, the very near past, actually, like less than 100 years ago, and certainly before that, racism, colonialism, sexism, queerphobia, classism, xenophobia, etc., were all normalized. They were not like fringe, but they were part of our institutions. So this is really crucial to understand when we talk about why racism exists today and how it exists today. When we think about 100 years ago, when we're having this explosion of science and technology and modernizing around the world, during that time, it was legal and accepted, for example, to discriminate against Black and Indigenous people, against immigrants who might today be racialized as white, but at the time would not have been, against those who had different religions. It was legal and accepted to take data or conduct medical experiments without consent or without regard to dignity or autonomy or anything of what we would consider ethics today. We didn't necessarily have to hide it from the public view because it was literally legal and accepted to use the justice system to lynch and execute Black and brown children, adults, no matter their gender, to seize land and resources from Indigenous people for whatever reason we wanted to. That's really important for all of us to reckon with, especially if we're wanting to work on anti-racism today in whatever our fields are. Today, when we look around, it's obvious that those sorts of values are not considered normal. They're considered, an aberration. There's something that's radical that we don't want to be a part of. They're not accepted. But when we look at the vestiges of that history, they're everywhere. It's both seen and unseen, like the uranium mining example that Denia just gave, right? She's an expert in nuclear engineering and just found that out yesterday, right? So the issues that we see today broadly, they did not appear in a vacuum, but we notice them today because broadly today, a lot more people care about the racism, the sexism, et cetera, and are horrified by what they see, but they simultaneously feel powerless and defensive to do anything about it. And really, in order to do anything about it, we have to accept that this soup of, toxic culture, whether we want it to be or not, it is embedded within all of us. So in order to reject it and be actively anti-racist, we have to be, both willing to take accountability for the ways that we may be victimized with those systems, but also how we may be oppressive in those systems.
So, Aditi, what comes next? What needs to happen?
Thank you, Michelle. That is such an important question. And I think the answer to that is something that we need to be thinking about as a field and community, as organizations, but also on an individual level. So let me try to lay it out actually on those different levels. I think as a field and community, we need to remedy some of the harms that we have done as this field and as nuclear energy and weapons have developed over the last several decades. I think in particular, we need to repair the harms that have been done to people and communities of color around the world, especially indigenous communities, as we've just been talking about. Most of the uranium, something around 70% of all uranium that's used in the world comes from mines that are on or near indigenous communities. And most of these mines have not been remediated. And it would seem like, this is something that should be done as soon as possible. And it's shocking that it hasn't been done already. That's a very specific thing. But I think more broadly, as we've said in the piece, the field and the community really must become more inclusive. We need more people of color. We need more women in positions of power and in roles where decisions about the form and the future of the field are made. And I think that we are calling for these changes at a time where broadly in the field, there's sort of this shift in thinking about decisions from a purely techno-economic perspective to a broader, more inclusive, more humanitarian way of thinking about how this field and its institutions should evolve. And I think a great example of this shift occurring in the field actually is seen in the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. The treaty calls for the prohibition of nuclear weapons on humanitarian grounds. And I think increasingly we need to reimagine the institutions that we have created in the past from this new humanitarian, human-centered, inclusive lens. And this is something that's going to take a long time. I think from an epistemic standpoint as well, there's a lot that the field needs to do to become more inclusive. And one of the main things actually that need to happen is that the field of nuclear engineering itself that trains the people who then go on to assume, in many cases, these positions of power, however we want to define power, in these different institutions. I think nuclear engineering as a field needs to broaden its intellectual and epistemic boundaries, and it needs to reconsider what counts as legitimate knowledge and who gets to make that knowledge and how that knowledge is funded. Because as Kate, Denia, and I have been talking about, these facts about the problematic history of the field that we've been discovering recently, this is something that everyone who enters the field should learn as part of their education. They should learn about both what is good about the field, but also the many harms that the field has caused. And so really, I think that repairing so many of the harms that the field has caused requires understanding the history of the field from the perspectives of people and communities that have been marginalized. And then we have to make sure, once we've understood these histories, that the ways in which we design our technologies and policies and institutions in the future accounts for the perspectives of these people and communities of color. I think on a personal level, in terms of what happens next, I think working together on this paper has stimulated us to think about our own research in new ways. I know that Kate was already, and I think will continue to work on this absolutely crucial and just really fascinating intersection of thinking about technology design and anti-racism. And I know that Denia and I also have been thinking about this for a while, but I think working on this paper together sort of accelerated our own efforts in thinking about how nuclear engineering as a field needs to reimagine itself. And those are just a couple of personal examples, but I think that we are a small group of people who are increasingly having written this paper, we're increasingly encountering other scholars and researchers who have started to think along these lines. And so it also feels like there's a critical mass of this kind of scholarship that is now emerging. And it's really exciting to see where this might go and how it might change the field in the future.
Yeah, I would just say that in terms of kind of going back to your question to what's next, even before we kind of collectively decide on the shape of the nuclear field, whatever that means for your sub-community, whether it's, arms control or nuclear waste management, I think we really just need to recognize as a professional community, the nuclear field writ large, that the technologies we work on are not apolitical, nor are they value neutral, right? They have racism, sexism, queerphobia, et cetera, baked into them, because at some point these attitudes were normalized. And I would be remiss to not mention that they are still normalized in many parts of our society, in the United States as well as globally. So as a result, we need to recognize that human action and our values do shape the technologies that we work on. And that these technological artifacts do encode these values and norms of the people, settings, and the times in which they were created, right? And I just want to say, it's okay to recognize it. It's nobody's fault. It would be only our fault if we didn't dig into what is available to us, right? And this is kind of where epistemic racism rears its ugly head again. Knowledge is available to us. It exists. We just have to go out and we have to make spaces and time and money, put funding and time towards, breaking down these epistemic silos. From a harm reduction perspective, it's okay to step outside of that silo and just recognize kind of in a broader societal sense what's going on and kind of think more broadly and more creatively how to kind of, fix it.
Aditi, final thoughts?
I guess to respond to why we wrote the piece, I think this has already been said before, so I might be repeating things that have been said. But I think what was so interesting about the piece is that we drew on the work of so many people who've been working on different parts of the problem from their own vantage points. And I think that the contribution of the piece was to pull all of these incredible works of scholarship together into a piece that was able to critique the field from all of these different perspectives. In writing this piece, we really were standing on the shoulders of giants, of the of the incredible people who've done all of this work before us. And so I hope that in offering the field these two frames of epistemic and institutional racism, we've given the field a way not only to diagnose its problems, but also a way to think about how to fix the field epistemically and institutionally. So how can we go from these very problematic forms of epistemic racism and institutional racism to epistemic equity and institutional equity? That's a field that I want to be a part of. That's a community that I want to be a part of. And as problematic as the history of the field and community has been, it's exciting to be in this time and to be in a position to be thinking about how to repair those problems and to move forward in a just and inclusive and equitable way, perhaps for the first time ever in the future of the field.
Well, our time is just about up. Aditi, Katlyn, Denia, thank you so much for joining, and rest assured this will not be the last. I really look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you.
Letters, we get letters, we get stacks and stacks of letters.
And now, everyone's favorite nuclear Q&A segment, back for 2021. Are you ready for this, Tom?
Bring it on, Michelle.
Pete from New York asks, if you could have the United States make one nuclear-related New Year's resolution, what would it be? And do you think it would stick?
Pete, thank you for your question. Great question. I guess if I were to have the United States make one nuclear-related resolution, it would be to never use nuclear weapons first, and to back that up with concrete actions. I think if we're thinking about what are the greatest threats to the United States from nuclear weapons, it's not intentional use, but it's accidental use, blundering into nuclear war. And one way to reduce the danger of that is to say that we will not use nuclear weapons first, and help reduce pressure on Russia in particular to feel that it has to stay on high alert, which increases the danger of Russia launching nuclear weapons by mistake. So my dream for a New Year's resolution would be a no first use pledge from the incoming Biden administration. And that is not too far from what the president-elect has already said. He supports sole purpose. That is, the sole purpose of U.S. nuclear weapons should be to deter their use by others. And that to me is essentially a no first use commitment. And then I would want the United States and the Biden administration to back up a no first use pledge with some concrete actions, which would be to eliminate ground-based ballistic missiles, the ICBMs, because if we're not going to use nuclear weapons first, then we don't need the weapons that we would reach to first in a first use situation. As many of our listeners know, ground-based ballistic missiles are sitting ducks. They're easy targets. So if we were to get attacked in a highly unlikely scenario by Russia, those weapons would be destroyed. And so they only have a first use mission. They don't have a second use mission because they would be destroyed and not available for any kind of retaliation. But that's okay because we have secure weapons on submarines at sea. So we do not need land-based ballistic missiles for deterrence. We can maintain deterrence without them. Their only use is for first use in a first strike scenario. So that would be the way to make a no first use pledge more credible. So Pete from New York, to answer your question, it would be a no first use pledge from the Biden administration, backed up by eliminating our land-based ballistic missiles.
Another week, Another question. Thank you, Tom. And thank you, Pete. And remember, if you would like to get your question on the air, tweet or DM us at PressButtonPod or send us an email at pressthebutton@plowshares.org.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil, Zach Brown, Derek Sender, and Will Lowry. Sound design by Derek Sender. Audio engineering by Derek Sender and Will Lowry. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.